We're going to start talking through just congruent figures to get you started into what we need to talk next, which is about proving triangles congruent. So we're going to start off first just by talking about the labeling for congruent figures and how to match them up. That's going to be increasingly important as you prove triangles congruent and as you list them congruent, because we have to make sure that they are in a correct order. So let's talk about that now. So the definition of congruent polygons. Polygons are congruent if and only if they have congruent corresponding parts. Okay, congruent corresponding parts is very, very important. So congruent triangles have congruent corresponding parts. And that means since they're triangles, they should have 3 congruent angles and they should have 3 congruent sides. All right, the same thing goes with congruent quadrilaterals. They should have congruent corresponding parts. And then since it's a quadrilateral, that means there should be 4 angles congruent and 4 sides congruent. Excuse me. So then when you name congruent polygons, we have to list the corresponding parts in the same order. And that's really, really important that you keep that order correct. So we're going to make sure these parts are in the correct order, they're in the same order. And if the order is already given to us, we're going to use that to help us out. All right, so to look first at this first example, you've got WXYZ is congruent to JKLM. Okay, remember the order matters. Okay, so the corresponding parts have to be in the same order. So it talks about first the congruent side. So I'm going to use the order of the letters to help me see which parts are congruent. So the first 2 letters in that in each set is WX and JK, because when we're talking about sides, remember we label sides with 2 letters. We labeled segments with 2 letters. So that means WX has to be congruent with JK, and I can put that here as my first set of congruent sides. Then I can go to the next set. So if I erase that part, now I can go to what's the second and third letter that group together? X, Y, and KL. So that means X, Y, and KL have to be congruent. Notice I'm adding a tick mark because I can't just do one, otherwise those would be congruent to the other. So I've got X, Y congruent to KL. Okay, I can go again from my next set. Now I've got my third and my fourth together. YZ should be congruent to LM. I'm going to mark this as I go because if I need to refer back to it, it's a lot easier to come back to later if I can just look at the diagram and match up the number of tick marks that I put. And then my last one, so this is the one that sometimes trips people up. I've went through all the way to the end, but I can also include, remember, the one where it's the first and the last. So WZ and JM. So WZ, and 4 tick marks there, and JM. Those are also congruent. Okay, so sides I'm matching up with the 2 letters using the same order that they're in that set. Okay, now angles we can mark with just 1 letter as long as it's the only angle there. And since we're talking about shapes, that's what's going to happen. So if I look, my first letter is W, and then my first letter in the other one is J. So those angles should be congruent. So I've got angle W is congruent to angle J. And I'm going to list that here. The second letter in each is X and Y. I've got X and K I meant. Sorry, my fault. So I've got X is congruent, and notice again I'm adding a tick mark, is congruent to K. So I've got angle X is congruent to angle K. Next I have that my third lettering is Y and got Y here and L here. So those are my next congruent ones. I've got to keep adding tick marks. I'm kind of going to run out of room here. I'm going to label that with just a 3 above it so I can Note that. So I've got y is congruent to L. And technically I've got these angles are congruent, right? So I need to have that angle marking. These are all segments, so I should have my markings with it. And then my last letter in each is angle Z is going to be congruent to angle M. Okay, I can call that angle 4. I'm just going to list it with a 4 because I'm out of room in my picture. Okay, but all I'm doing is I'm using the order of those letters to help define which segments are congruent, which angles are congruent. Remember, segments I'm looking for 2 letters, angles I'm looking for 1. And the reason writing that down, or even especially marking it, is very, very helpful. Now I can answer simple questions like if the measure of angle L is 89, then which other angle measures equals 89 degrees? Okay, well, angle L, if I go there, let's see how I marked it. I marked it with a 3 because I ran out of room. So I'm going to look anywhere where there's a 3, which is going to have to be in the other shape, and that's at angle Y. So then I quickly know that angle Y is 89 degrees. Okay, again, I could easily note that too just by looking at the picture or looking at the original congruent statement up here. Okay, L was 89, L was the third letter, so if I go to the third letter in the other one, I know that one is 89 as well. Okay, so for example 2, keep that in mind. So angle T, what's congruent to angle T? Well, T was the third letter here in that grouping of points. So what's the third letter in my other grouping of points? It's K. So angle K has to be congruent to angle T. I'm going to erase that so I can kind of switch to a highlighter here. And then it wants to see the order THPA. So as we can see, I'm using all of the letters, but I'm starting with T, which is the third letter in there. So I'm going to start with K to keep going. Then they went to H. H was the fourth letter. So now I've got E is going to be my next one because that was the fourth letter in the other one. Then they went to P. If I notice, I can kind of highlight this all together because they started at the front and kept going. So PA, so the first 2 now, so then it's going to be BI to finish it off. Congruency questions should not be difficult as long as you understand the order matters that you're putting it in. If you're trying to place it yourself, make sure where you start with on one shape, you start in the same with that congruent part and move to the next congruent part in the same order. If it's already given to you, these can be really, really quick. Okay, all we need to do is just make sure we're looking at the order they're in and using that same order. So they want to know that UN is 25. So I've got these 2 here are 25. And then I've got SU. So the first 2 is supposed to be 30. Notice I'm just kind of labeling it so I can kind of piece stuff together. Now they want to know AY. So I'm going to highlight that section here. I've got AY. Well, AY is the last 2 letters it applies to. The last 2 letters really only apply to UN, and UN we said was 25. So then I know AY is 25. Okay, again, we're marking what we need to know because that's the one we want to relate it to. Even here, I can jump to what do they want me to know? They want me to know what is S. So S is my first letter, which means, well, I need to take a look and see if I can start piecing this together. They gave me A. They gave me the second letter, not what I need to match S. They also gave me N. So if I go take a look at N, in fact, I'm going to switch my highlighter here. If they gave me N, that's also not what I need. It's not my first letter either. But if I notice, now I've highlighted one I need, which is the first letter, the second letter they gave me, and the third letter they gave me. So when I put all of them together, if they should have congruent parts, right? These, oops, let me switch that up, sorry. When I take the 3 congruent parts together, remember these 3 should be congruent to these 3, right? So S and R should be congruent. U and A should be congruent. And N and Y should be congruent. So S and R are the ones I don't know. A and U are 27. And N and Y are 63. Well, remember, we know that the triangle adds up to 180 degrees. So if I have 2 out of the 3, I can easily piece this together. 27 plus 63 is going to give me 90 degrees. And if I subtract that from 180, I know what's left over has to be my angle S and R. So that's going to give me 90 degrees. Okay, remember your old stuff that triangles add up to 180 degrees. But a lot of this is just coming down to you reading a congruency statement and realize the order matters and the congruent parts will match up. So if you're looking for segment, again, that's the 2 letters, keep the same order. If they're the first 2 letters, match it to the first 2. If they're the middle 2, match it to the middle 2. And then angles are just going to be 1 letter. The nice thing is if when we are trying to prove congruent triangles, we don't have to prove that everything matches. We only have to prove that certain parts match. Okay, so we don't have to prove all of the corresponding parts are congruent. We just have to prove a certain amount. And we do have 6 ways to do that, so we're going to walk through that in this next video. If you have questions, be sure to let us know.